Welcome. So exciting to see you all here. It's great to see everybody and have everybody. Thank you so much for coming out on this cold day. I'm Stephen Pitti, professor of History American Studies in the R&M and director of Yale Center for the Study of Race, Indigeneity, and Transnational Migration, which has helped to support this event. Really happy to remind you at the outset that we in New Haven here are sitting on territory that's long been the home of Mohegan, Mashantucket, Pequot, Eastern Pequot, Schaghticoke, Golden Hill, Pawcatuck, Niantic, Quinnipiac, and other Algonquin-speaking peoples, and that we continue ourselves to be revitalized by their survivance every day. We're delighted to help support this event as RITM along with Ezra Stiles College at Yale. And I want to thank a number of people for making this happen. Kathy Dunn and Mark Levinson in Ezra Stiles, Nicole Edwards and Maggie Katz and Mary Taylor Lewis and Victoria Stone Cadena in RITM, and the Andrew W. Mellon Foundation for providing the funding that made this event possible. Let me also recognize that we have today with us the Poet Laureate of the state of Connecticut, Antoinette Brim Bell, who's here and who has joined us today. Thank you, Antoinette, for being here. I've also asked, before we turn the podium, so-called, over to our guests here in front, to just say a few logistical words. First, I want to make sure everybody knows that the Yale University Art Gallery closes at 5 p.m. So if you left any belongings in the lockers in the art gallery, you're going to need to retrieve those now, or at least before 5 o'clock, because the gallery will be closed. You won't be able to get back into the lockers for your keys, your wallets, your jackets, and all the rest. So please do go fetch things from the lockers before 5. There's really no way to open up the building after that time. Second, although I'm not demonstrating it now, the art gallery requires the use of face masks in this space. So please remain masked throughout the event while you're here. That's very important to our speaker and to all of us. Third, I wanted just to alert everybody that this event is being recorded. You'll see there's a camera in the back, and there may be other cameras. So just wanted to make sure that you're aware of that. Finally, logistically, we're going to open the program up for audience questions in the last roughly 20 minutes of our event today. So please, when that time comes, if you do have a question, use the microphone, which I think will be circulating, so that our guest can hear you and so that everybody else in the room can hear you as well. I'll add that at the very, very end, we'll have time for audience members to come forward to request a book signing by Ada Limón at the end of the event around 6 o'clock. It's going to be pretty short. We have a hard stop. It'll be a pretty quick session, but we'll do our best to accommodate as many people as want to have a book signed. And I'm going to get out of the way, but as I leave the stage, I have the pleasure of introducing the real host of this event, Professor Alicia Schmidt Camacho. Whom I know quite well. At Yale, Professor Schmidt Camacho is the head of Ezra Stiles College. She's a faculty member in and former chair of the program in Ethnicity, Race, and Migration, and she's a scholar whose work has focused on migration, the US-Mexico border, Latinx studies, and other topics and fields. I'll avoid staying too long to sing her praises, but I'll just invite you to join me in thanking and welcoming Alicia Schmidt Camacho.
Okay, this is really beautiful. I have the joyful task of introducing the 24th Poet Laureate, Ada Limón, and opening our conversation this afternoon. What a gift it is to be together. Thank you, Ada Limón, for giving us this occasion to gather in community in the service of poetry. Ada Limón, as you know, grew up in Sonoma, California, and resides in Lexington, Kentucky, where she writes and teaches. She's the author of 6 books of poetry, including The Caring, which won the National Books Critics Circle Award for Poetry. She hosted the celebrated poetry podcast, The Slowdown, and her new book of poetry, The Hurting Kind, is out now from Milkweed Editions and is a candidate for the 2023 Southern Book Prize. And I want to thank my colleagues at the Yale Center for the Study of Race, Indigeneity, and Transnational Migration, for the students and colleagues in Ezra Stiles and around campus and ethnicity, race, and migration and other communities who've shared the love of poetry with me and shared so much with me. And I want to give special thanks also to our host, the Yale University Art Gallery, for welcoming us. And I want to thank someone else who's not here, Vaughn Fielder, representative for Ada Limón, who runs something called the Field Office, where she makes the most exquisite books and broadsides. Please look for it. Before we begin, I want to mention how marvelous it has been to prepare for this occasion. Ada, your arrival has helped give us a chance to gather and be in celebration, something we needed. In Ezra Stiles, we began talking about inviting Ada Limón some time ago, and since we announced the visit, I keep hearing testimony from so many people about all that her poetry and her work has represented for them. And in the week between drafting my message of inquiry and actually sending it, Ada Limón was named the Poet Laureate. But you were our laureate first. And I don't remember many moments where I actually could trust my government's judgment. Least of all in anything as important as poetry and art. But the office of Poet Laureate, housed in the Library of Congress, may be the one authority in the land to whom I will happily submit. And it was beautiful to watch the Librarian of Congress, Carla Hayden, name you to this post, Ada, to talk about your poetry being a force in the world, one that fosters connection, intimacy, healing, one that invites us to the table. And Tracy K. Smith, also a Poet Laureate, called you a poet of ecstatic revelation, whose poems offer deep wisdom and urgent vulnerability, driven by language that feels not only beautiful, but permanent and powerfully wrought like a mountain. That is certainly how we've experienced your work here. Your poems have been integral to our life as a community. They've given us a language for finding one another, for coming together in difficult moments, for imagining living beyond the time of pandemic, for imagining how we can thrive. Thank you. And so I'm going to move over here so that we can begin more conversation and Ada can face out to see all of you. Can you hear me? Okay. Oh, yes, you can. So my favorite moment when you were at the Library of Congress was right at the beginning, after you'd been announced and you stepped up and you greeted everyone, you sort of announced your arrival in this post and you said, "We roll deep." We roll deep. And it was a moment of recognition for me, because I think, again, like, what are we trying to do here? We're trying to gather ourselves together, to build power together in something precious. Mm-hmm. Precious the way that art is. Mm-hmm. Precious the way that art accompanies us in our lives when we need it. How do we be together? And so it struck me that "we roll deep" was kind of an artist statement, and as well as a mission for you in this role of Poet Laureate. And I wanted to ask you about that, because in your art, you contain multitudes. You know, your art brings multitudes.
I love that. Thank you so much for that. I feel like it's, first of all, a beautiful introduction. and just such a gift to be here with you all. Thank you for coming out. I think one of the things that I've always sort of pushed against is that sort of myth that we make art alone, and that myth that like one person rises. I just don't believe it. I have always believed that we make art in community, even if what we're working on aren't exactly collaborations. What we're actually doing is often reaching out to one another and saying, hey, will you read this one poem? Or hey, will you listen to this song? Or hey, will you come to this play? Or, you're having this, you're always reaching out and you're always getting that support from the people you need. And that to me is all part of the art making process. And so when I'm saying we roll deep, I really do believe that we do that even if deep means two people, right? I'm not saying you have to, have this huge network of people to support you. Sometimes you need one other person, that just says, yeah, this, keep doing it. And sometimes they don't even need to critique it. Sometimes it's better if they don't. Sometimes it's just better if they say, yes, keep going. But I think it's important to remember that sometimes it can look like one person is doing a lot. And in reality, a lot of people are doing a lot of things, and all of us are in community.
Thank you. And Ada, as I told you earlier today, at the onset of the pandemic, we really had to reinvent the university, for the conditions of separation and isolation, and that's really hard. And one thing that arose, I think, in many parts of the world were these chain mail messages, and I was lucky to be receiving messages with poetry, and then the instruction would be, here's this poem, now you have to send your poem to these 10 other strangers. And it went around, and it was international, and eventually, I was getting repeats from people, so it was clear that this was doing some great work, right? And your poems were there. More often than not, the one that I always put out there was Dead Stars. That one really works on me. But then when I took up my post as the head of college and was writing a weekly newsletter, my Dean Temple's here with me, we were trying to figure out how to build connections to students and to build a sense of community across many time zones for students who were in spaces where, maybe learning was the last thing on their mind during their especially difficult days. How do we be present for them? How do we invite them in? And how do we have the conversations about things that we really need to talk about, right? And again, your poems gave me a way to give a piece of something beautiful, something to think about, but most often really invite people in. And I put a lot of different poems out there, and I did notice that the ones from you, I kept hearing more. And then also, when students were sending me ideas for poems that they wanted to hear, they were sending me your poems.
Oh, I love that.
And I've been thinking a lot about that, because there's a lot of really very beautiful poetry out there, right? But there was something about your attention to the world, your attention to emotion, that really I felt like was what we needed in the university at that moment, right? The university sometimes presents itself as a space of learning where we leave emotions aside to achieve or to accomplish, right? And we receive wisdom. But in your poetry, there's the knowledge that we're really struggling sometimes, that we're kind of a mess, and that we might hurt, and that's actually the best we can be right now, is true to what we're feeling. And it felt to me like the students were able to commune with you and then through you, me, because you made that space, and poetry made that space. And I wanted to ask you to maybe think about the way you think about emotions, and also that I know you're a teacher, how you might think about the teaching in your poetry.
Yeah, thank you. That was really beautiful. I think that one of the big things for me is that there's people will say things like, oh, poetry can do this, or poetry can do that, or you should read a poem, it'll make you feel hopeful. And we were laughing today. It's like, well, that depends on what poem you read. You know? Because if you read Philip Larkin's poem about the groundhog, I don't think you're going to feel very hopeful after that poem. And so I think that there's a lot of sort of misconceptions about what poetry can do, and I think it's only because it limits it, you know. And for me, I think it's not just that it makes you feel one thing or another, it makes you feel happy, makes you feel hopeful, makes you reconnect with some sort of long lost feeling that you have to dig up from someplace you've been suppressing it. I think it's really that it just makes you feel. And I think that is important. And I think that we've been living at a time where we've just had to numb so much of our lives. And a lot of that is necessary. Like, I don't even think that's necessarily a bad thing, that we've had to numb things, because it's really hard to feel all the things that we've been feeling. And I think poetry is that way of sort of tapping into that and being able to, like, oh, right, I am a thinking, feeling human being going through all of these things. I have these complex emotions working within me. And in doing so, feeling like, oh, I'm reminded that this is what being a human being is like. It's not just putting my head down and getting from point A to point B. You know, it's not just survival. Can it also be flourishing? You know, can it also be witnessing, experiencing? And I think that's a big part of what I've been trying to do with my work for a long time, which is like, can it help me each time I write a poem recommit in some way to the world? That each time I go to the page, I'm saying, here I am, I'm here. You know, it's like a map that says you are here. You know, each poem is like, you are here. And that, I think, feels just as important as something that might perhaps contain more answers or wisdom or knowledge. Poetry doesn't do that. It contains more questions, and the questions lead to more questions. And in that, it's just sort of accepting that fluidness of life, and that, this amorphous aspect of changing and growing and being more in tune with ourselves. The great poet C.D. Wright said, the goal is not to make a story, but to experience the whole mess. Mm. And I think about that all the time, because we kind of want to do this tidy thing in our head. This is what happened. But really, our jobs are just to experience the whole mess.
And something pretty extraordinary happens in the way you guide us to that mess, right? And you hold us there. It seems to me that it's no accident that the volume before The Hurting Kind was the carrying, right? Mm-hmm. There's so much required of us to be caring, and yet that caring is also the richness of life, right? Mm-hmm. And that's our vehicle for joy and fullness, right? Mm-hmm. That's the capacity to do that. And I just, like many people, I went to funerals in the last few years, right? We've seen a lot of violence in the last few years, intimate violence as well as terrifying terror in the world, right? And one of the things that I noticed is that it's like a saying now to say there are no words when you're greeting someone in grief. But of course there are, And that always seemed to me like, why are we letting ourselves off the hook, right? How do we be present in these moments? How do we actually create the language we need? So again, I turn to your poetry because I think you're attentive to where fear atomizes us and pushes away from each other. And you're not afraid to look for language for the unsayable, to gesture towards what is unsayable, and to leave it there for us to disentangle. And so I'm going to give you an example of a line that lives with me now. It's part of my mental and spiritual furniture. Again, from Dead Stars, I am a hearth of spiders these days, a nest of trying. There's so much happening there. And earlier today, when we were talking with students, which was beautiful, you used the word ongoingness as a thing, as something that is both what we are tasked to do, but is also glorious. What a gift to experience our own ongoingness. So again, I just want to invite you to talk about, you're tapping into something for us there, and it's a lesson, but it's a lesson that it seems hard won. So I wanted to ask you how you've thought about that.
Yeah, thank you for that. I feel like there's so much grief and processing that we have to do to just live, to just live. And it's funny because we can think that we don't have to grieve, right? And then like 6 months later, you're like, oh, what's happening? You're like, oh, right. I am grieving this thing that I didn't go through, or that I thought I was fine, And I think that keeps happening to us. And there's not just the grief of the pandemic, but there's there's the species loss and the plant loss and like the planet itself grieving from our own harm and all of these things that we're processing. And I think it's like anyone else, it's very easy for me to shut down to it, I'd much rather have a drink and binge watch Netflix than think about all the wounds I want to carry, But at the same time, I know that if I'm not working through some of that stuff, not all of it, I can't take it all on, but maybe a little part of it, a little edge of it. And if I can kind of tease it out and work through it a little bit, I know that I will be saner. And I know that I can be kinder to other people because it's my way of being kind to myself. And so in a lot of ways, I think about, there's this great Buddhist monk named Lama Rod Owens. I don't know if you know him. And he has this, he talks about that the goal is longevity. And I think about that a lot because it's very easy to think like, I just need to get through the day. Or I just need to get to 5 o'clock or whatever it is, or to hand this final in, or to get this project done, and then I can start to think about other things. And he talks about longevity because the way that we burn out, right, the way that we burn out as artists or whoever we are is by not dealing with some of these big ticket topics and just trying to sort of suppress them or trying to take them all on at once. And then wondering why in a year from now we can't write anything, So I keep thinking about a lot of my poems are also a way of caretaking myself, and a way of recognizing that my need to be alive and witnessing the world is a need that I would like to continue. And so sometimes when I'm going into the well, I have to give myself that ladder out. Like I have to be like, okay, this is, you've spent some time down here. Good for you. Now, where are the stairs? And I think that's really important for us, not only as artists, but as human beings. It's like, it's one thing to face the darkness, but it's another thing to know that, you have a way out. And I think that's very much a part of me making poems, that it's not just about, I love when they land with someone and how they land with someone and hearing how it's affected. It's like, it's deeply emotional to me and a little overwhelming sometimes to hear someone say, oh, this moved me. I love that. But oftentimes when I'm making the poem, I'm not thinking about that. I'm thinking of how do I get really honest with myself, and how do I say something that feels unsayable? And then how do I create spaces within the poem where I can breathe a little bit, you know? And some of those poems, you know, turn towards the light, and some of them turn away. But hopefully there's enough balance in them as they go that it feels like there's a sense of wholeness there.
You've used a word a couple times in this conversation, witnessing.
Yeah.
And it is there in your early poems, but it is sort of a structuring idea in The Hurting Kind. And I think of it as something that you have developed as a vocation in this work that you do. And I was thinking about how you think about that term, because there's so much in The Hurting Kind about being a witness and not needing the things you're looking at to give you anything back. In fact, the fox is completely indifferent. The birds are indifferent, right? But the task of witness is a constant, and it's a process that is revelatory for you and for us by reading. And the witnessing is so often directed toward the non-human world and is often a way of affiliating us with the non-human world, and you've just spoken about that a bit. And then I thought there's something else that's really powerful about your concept of witness that I think we forget. We think witness is us seeing, attending, and speaking to something. But you really want us to be there with our bodies. You're attentive to the body is a witness, right? You know, the body is to be present, and the body experiences the world, and we have to make space for how the body is in the world. And there's the beautiful moment where the body is fragile, and you say the body is so body. I just
so body.
As a person who lives in a body that is a bit puzzling sometimes, I'm like, oh, it is so body.
Yeah.
But I just wanted to ask you to talk a little bit about witness and what that means for you.
I love that question and the many different layers to it. I feel like there's, you know, to start with the body. That sounds like a Creeley poem. He has that line, right, about the body. The plan is the body. The plan is the body. He just says that over and over again. It's wonderful. I think that there's a level in which because I have an undergraduate degree in theater, I was taught about the body as a tool and the body as instrument. And so when I moved to poetry, breath work and, you know, sort of the isness of the body was in the poems, because that's how you make things, was to encourage the body's presence, to be present within the body. But I too, and I love that word you said, puzzling, a body that can sometimes be puzzling. Who doesn't have a body that can sometimes be puzzling? Especially at a time where, like, you know, they ask us about symptoms. It's like, I think I've had every symptom. My friend Kristen Dombeck, who's a wonderful nonfiction writer, said that she just wants to write a book called Symptoms, which is just all the symptoms that all of her women friends like send her, just on a daily basis. Like, so what are the symptoms today? So I think that, you know, I live in a body that's you know, oftentimes in pain. I try not to say the word chronic pain because I believe it will someday go away. But I do, you know, I do live in a body that's a little more difficult to get around sometimes than others. And I experience vertigo, and I have scoliosis. So there's these just things that kind of keep me from being completely, totally free in the body. And so I think when I write my poems and I think about witnessing, I'm thinking about how are all the senses. And I can't witness without being like, well, if I'm witnessing and I'm taking a deep breath, you think, oh, my back hurts a little bit when I take a deep breath, right? There's all these other things that are in the body when I do that. I used to love it when, meditation teachers would say like, just sit and be in the body. And I'd be like, well, what if the body is the problem? I was like the one person on Zoom. I was like the one person on Zoom that I was like, oh, finally, I just get to be a head. I've always only wanted to be a head. I was like, this is amazing. Now it's like, okay, body, we can do it. And so I think that witnessing had to include the blood, the body, every part of it. And it's funny when you talk about like that moment about it, because I remember in one of the poems when I was writing The Hurting Kind, having this moment of being like, it was during when we were all really isolating, and we weren't. I wasn't even. I was just waving to neighbors and feeling very alone, and I just literally just like crawled on my belly onto the grass and just like laid there and got really low. And I kept thinking, this is like low snake energy. And I was like, I'm just going to have some low snake energy and see what happens. But it was this way of being like, okay, how do I witness from down here? How do I witness from up here? And then I thought about all the different animals and birds that are like seeing what they're seeing from their different viewpoints, right? The birds that kind of twist their head and turn on, look at you upside down, and the trees, how they're witnessing you from up there, but we're standing on their roots, they're just underneath us all the time. And all those different viewpoints and how that connects us, and how strange it is that we think it's like just the poet going into the world being like, I see this.
Yeah. Right?
But that's not how poetry happens. It's often like, oh, I wonder what that bird thinks of me, and that all of that is in tandem with, of course, like how the body is also nature and is also animal, and that feels very important to my work and my life.
Thank you. And will you read for us?
Yes, I will read for you. What if I said no? I would be like, no. Yes, of course I will read. I shall go to the podium. It's like a whole different area over there. We'll turn this off. Can you hear me okay? Great. We were laughing that I was like, well, we can just kind of, take it as it goes. And then we realized that we were both talkers. So we're like, no, we actually need to keep an eye on the time to be respectful of everyone. So I thought I would read, I think it's going to be, I'm going to guess 10 poems. I'm going to give you that number to make you feel a little modicum of control in the otherwise uncontrollable situation that is the poetry reading. You can count down or count up, however you feel like. I'm going to start with this poem that is in the Carrying, which is, I think, speaks to some of the things we were just talking about in that conversation, with sort of looking for some ways to caretake the self, but also sort of denying a kind of wisdom. And I'd like to tell you a little bit of the background of it, which is that it is a poem that I initially wanted it to start the collection, and my editor was like, no, that's a lot. And then also I'll say that it was a prompt that was, the Academy of American Poets asked me to write a poem that would be the first poem of the year in 2016. And of course, it was, how do you do that? They're like, just set the tone for the year. So, and it was a hard year, and so this is the poem. The Leash. After the birthing of bombs, of forks and fear, the frantic automatic weapons unleashed, the spray of bullets into a crowd holding hands, that brute sky opening in a slate metal maw that swallows only the unsayable in each of us. What's left? Even the hidden nowhere river is poisoned orange and acidic by a coal mine. How can you not fear humanity? Want to lick the creek bottom dry, to suck the deadly water up into your own lungs like venom? Reader, I want to say, don't die. Even when silvery fish after fish comes back belly up and the country plummets into a crepitating crater of hatred, isn't there still something singing? The truth is, I don't know. But sometimes I swear I hear it, the wound closing like a rusted over garage door, and I can still move my living limbs into the world without too much pain, can still marvel at how the dog runs straight toward the pickup trucks, breaknecking down the road because she thinks she loves them. Because she's sure, without a doubt, that the loud, roaring things will love her back. Her soft, small self alive with desire to share her goddamn enthusiasm. Until I yank the leash back to save her, because I want her to survive forever. Don't die, I say. And we decide to walk for a bit longer, starlings high and fevered above us, winter coming to lay her cold corpse down upon this little plot of earth. Perhaps we are always hurtling our bodies toward the thing that will obliterate us, begging for love from the speeding passage of time. And so maybe, like the dog obedient at my heels, we can walk together, peacefully, at least until the next truck comes. Thank you. Thank you. My dog loves poems about her. She's a pug, so, everyone's like, oh, pugs are so funny. And I was like, no, they're funny because they're very serious. And this is a poem that I wrote for my mother. And one of the students I met with today said that she read this book with her mother, and so thought I would read this. It's a poem that began with the ending for me, and then I built backwards, which I think has only ever happened one other time for me. The raincoat. When the doctor suggested surgery and a brace for all my youngest years, my parents scrambled to take me to massage therapy, deep tissue work, osteopathy, and soon my crooked spine unspooled a bit. I could breathe again and move more in a body unclouded by pain. My mom would tell me to sing songs to her the whole 45-minute drive to Middle Two Rock Road and 45 minutes back from physical therapy. She'd say that even my voice sounded unfettered by my spine afterward. So I sang and sang because I thought she liked it. I never asked her what she gave up to drive me or how her day was before this chore. Today, at her age, I was driving myself home from yet another spine appointment, singing along to some maudlin but solid songs on the radio. And I saw a mom take her raincoat off and give it to her young daughter when a storm took over the afternoon. My God, I thought, my whole life I've been under her raincoat, thinking it was somehow a marvel that I never got wet. And then I'll read this poem because it was mentioned, and you can hear the poem that actually this began with a sound, which was the sound of recycling bins rolled out all together and how it sounds like thunder. You know, there's like that little moment where you're like, what is that sound? And you're like, oh, it's like thunder. And then you realize it's just like your neighbor with like the recycling bin. Of course, it's not about that, but that's what that's what sort of came in my head. Dead stars. Out here, there's a bowing even the trees are doing. Winter's icy hand at the back of all of us. Black bark, slick yellow leaves, a kind of stillness that feels so mute it's in another year. I am a hearth of spiders these days, a nest of trying. We point out the stars that make Orion as we take out the trash, the rolling containers a song of suburban thunder. It's almost romantic as we adjust the waxy blue recycling bin until you say, man, we should really learn some new constellations. And it's true. We keep forgetting about Antlia, Centaurus, Draco, Lacerta, Hydra, Lyra, Lynx. But mostly we're forgetting we're dead stars too. My mouth is full of dust, and I wish to reclaim the rising, to lean in the spotlight of streetlight with you towards what's larger within us. Look, we are not unspectacular things. We've come this far, survived this much. What would happen if we decided to survive more, to love harder? What if we stood up with the synapses in flesh and said no? No to the rising tides. Stood for the many mute mouths of the sea, the land. What would happen if we used our bodies to bargain for the safety of others, for Earth? If we declared a clean night? If we stopped being terrified? If we launched our demands into the sky, made ourselves so big people could point to us with the arrows they make in their minds, rolling their trash bins out after all of this is over? And I'll read just one more from the carrying, and then I'll move on to the hurting kind. And you guys can hear me okay? Okay, how are you doing out there? Are you good? Okay, good. I had this incredible pleasure of going to Mexico City to be a part of the Fandango that was a celebration with Dr. Biden and Dr. Gutierrez Müller, who's the First Lady of Mexico. Though she doesn't like to be called the First Lady of Mexico. She just likes to be called Dr. Gutierrez Müller. And she sat next to me on stage and read this poem in English. And I got to see her do that, and it was really emotional for me. So this is a poem I wrote as a letter poem for my dear friend Natalie Diaz. It's the first poem in our series. Cargo. I wish I could write to you from underwater, the warm bath covering my ears, one of which has 3 marks in the exact shape of a triangle, my own atmosphere's asterism. Last night, the fire engine sirens were so loud they drowned out even the constant bluster of the inbound freight trains. Did you know the R.J. Corman Railroad runs 500 feet from us? Before everything shifted, and I aged into this body, my grandparents lived above San Mateo Canyon, where the Southern Pacific Railroad roared each scorching California summer day. I watched for the trains, howling as they came. Manuel is in Chicago today, and we've both admitted that we're traveling with our passports now. Reports of ice raids, and both of our bloods are requiring new medication. I wish I could go back to the windy dock, drinking pink wine and talking smack. Now it's gray and pitchfork. The supermarket here is full of grass seed, like spring might actually come, but I don't know. And you? I heard from a friend you're still working on saving words. All I've been working on is napping, and maybe being kinder to others, to myself. Just this morning, I saw 7 cardinals, brash and bold as sin, in a leafless tree. I let them be for a long while before I shook the air and screwed it all up just by being alive too. Am I braver than those birds? Do you ever wonder what the trains carry? Aluminum ingots, plastic, brick, corn syrup, limestone, fury, alcohol, joy. All the world is moving. Even sand from one shore to another is being shuttled. I live my life half afraid and half shouting at the trains when they thunder by. This letter to you is both. If you were counting, just 6 more to go. Begin with this poem for my stepmother, who passed away in 2010. A lovely human being. And also one of my favorite plants, which is one of the first signs of spring. It's probably here too. You have Forsythia. Yeah. It's a prose poem, so it reads a little differently. I'll read it so you can hear the sound. Forsythia. At the cabin in Snug Hollow, near McSwain Branch Creek, just spring, all the animals are out, and my beloved and I are lying in bed in a soft silence. We are talking about how we carry so many people with us wherever we go, how even when simply living, these unearned moments are a tribute to the dead. We are both expecting to hear an owl as the night deepens. All afternoon from the porch, we watched an eastern towhee furiously build her nest in the untamed Forsythia, with its yellow spilling out onto the horizon. I told him that the way I remember the name Forsythia is that when my stepmother, Cynthia, was dying that last week, she said lucidly but mysteriously, "More yellow." And I thought, yes, more yellow. And I nodded, because I agreed, of course, more yellow. And so now in my head, when I see that yellow tangle, I say, Forsythia, 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 more yellow. It is night now, and the owl never comes, only more of night, and what repeats in the night. That one always does something to me. I say that like someone else wrote it. I was like, whew, that one really gets to me. Let's see. I'll read a poem about rethinking old myths. We were talking about that before, and I think that it's important sometimes to just let go of things that people have told you or you've held on to that feels like just not true, or maybe just not useful anymore. You know, I used to have people who would say, "Oh, you always do this," and I think I am like that. And then maybe 5 years later, I was like, I'm not like that. And this is a time when, right when my parents got divorced, I had a woman, a mother of a friend of mine, come up and say, "I'm so sorry you're from a broken home now." And I remember thinking, "Oh, my home is broken?" Like I thought it seemed okay, actually. I was like, they seem a lot happier, to be honest. Anyway, so right in the middle of the early days of the pandemic, when we still weren't seeing anyone, masked or unmasked, this poem came to me with the first line. Joint custody. Why did I never see it for what it was? Abundance. 2 families, 2 different kitchen tables, 2 sets of rules, 2 creeks, 2 highways, 2 step-parents with their fish tanks or 8-tracks or cigarette smoke or expertise in recipes or reading skills. I cannot reverse it. The record scratched and stopping to that original chaotic track. But let me say, I was taken back and forth on Sundays, and it was not easy, but I was loved each place. And so I have 2 brains now, 2 entirely different brains. The one that always misses where I'm not, and the one that is so relieved to finally be home. And then I'll read this poem. I maybe like many of you, if you're having a bad day or you're stressed or anxious, you just watch animal videos. And it's just like, you just like push replay, like, I need to see that bird doing that thing again, or that cat eating the most cat food it possibly can out of the bowl. Or whales. I love just videos of whales. This is one about a mountain lion. And of course, oftentimes I say this is about this, and then there's a lot of other things that are at play. I hope I feel like I'm being very, reductress to my own poems. The mountain lion. I watched the video clip over and over, night vision cameras flickering her eyes an unholy green. The way she looked, the 6-foot fence up and down, like it was nothing but a speed bump, then cleared the man-made border in one impressive leap. A glance over the shoulder, an annoyance, and as if you could keep me out or keep me in. I don't know what it was that made me press replay and replay. Not fear, though I'd be terrified if I was face to face with her or heard her prowling in the night. It was just that I don't think I've ever made anything look so easy. Never looked behind me and grinned or grimaced because nothing could stop me. I liked the idea of it, though. Felt like a dream you could will into being. See a fence? Jump it. I'll read this poem for my grandfather. And my grandfather on my father's side, my paternal grandfather, abuelo paterno, and he was Puripecha, and he came from Mexico when he was quite young and was a foster child. And I read this poem because I want to bring him into this space and also think about all the people that were artists but maybe didn't get a chance to be artists. And I think sometimes we can feel like we're making art, and maybe it's like, I feel like I need to keep this poem in my heart when I'm like running through the airport, very glamorous life, trying to like glide into the plane, being like, don't leave without me, and be like, right, I'm doing this because I get to do this. And I think sometimes we need to say that about lots of things in our lives. Heart on fire. As a foster child, my grandfather learned not to get in trouble. Mexican and motherless, dead as she was from tuberculosis, he practiced words in a new language and kept his slender head down. When the other boys begged him to slip into the music shop's upper window to steal harmonicas for each of them, music being important, thievery being secondary, he refused. When the cops came to spot the boys who robbed the music store, they could easily find the ones spitting broken notes into the air, joyously mouthing the stainless steel, mimicking men on street corners busking for coins. But not my grandfather. He knew not to risk it all for a stolen moment of exaltation. It's easy to imagine this is who I come from, a line of serious men who follow the rules. But might I add that later he was a dancer, a singer, an actor whose best roles ended up on the cutting room floor, a cut-up, a ham who liked a good story, who would have told you life was a series of warnings, but also magic. Once he was sent for a box of matches, and he put that box of strike anywheres in the pocket of his madras shirt and ran home. He ran so fast to be on time, to be good, and when he did so, the whole box ignited. So he was a boy running down the canyon road with what looked like a heart on fire. He'd laugh when he told you this. A heart on fire, he'd say, so you'd remember. And then I'll read just 3 more poems. This is a poem that I wrote actually for Greenpeace, and it was right after the fires in Sonoma of 2017, and it was on a thread on Twitter, and the other day, and it was all these apology poems, and it was great. I went on it on the plane, and it was like all of these people were sharing their favorite poems that had apologies in them, and I was like, what a great! You get to teach a whole course on just like an apology poem. So I thought I would read this because it reminded me of my own poem. Salvage. On the top of Mount Pisgah, on the western slope of the Mayacamas, there's a madrone tree that's half burned from the fires, half alive from nature's need to propagate. One side of her is black ash, and at her root is what looks like a cavity hollowed out by flame. On the other side, silvery green broadleaf shoots ascend toward the winter light, and her bark is a cross between a bay horse and a chestnut horse, red and velvety like the animal's neck she resembles. Staring at the tree for a long time now, I am reminded of the righteousness I had before the scorch of time. I miss who I was. I miss who we all were before we were this, half alive to the brightening sky, half dead already. I place my hand on the unscarred bark that is cool and unsullied, and because I cannot apologize to the tree, to my own self I say, I am sorry. I am sorry I have been so reckless with your life. And let's see here. I'll read this poem. It's another prose poem. Do you guys know the instrument, the jawbone? It's an actual jawbone of a horse or a donkey, and it makes most amazing music. Instrumentation. If I could ever play an instrument for real, I like the idea of playing the jawbone, the rattle of something dead in your hands, the thing that beats back at the sky and says, I'm still here, even though clearly the donkey isn't here, or the horse isn't here, just the teeth and the jaw making music like resurrection or haunting or just plain need. What I like most is that the jawbone is an idiophone, which I misread once as ideaphone. But an idiophone is just that it makes music by the whole thing vibrating without strings. I want that kind of reeling in the wind, all the loose, dry teeth, all the old bones of the skull, all the world, and the figure swaying with its stick to make untuned music even death cannot deny. And I'll close with this poem, and then if you have any questions, you can ask. This is a poem that I wrote during the very early days of the pandemic, and people would call me and ask me about, isn't it true that we need poetry now more than ever? And I was like, is it true? We need lots of things, like healthcare and a vaccine, and different modes of support. But while this was happening, I was also making a list of subjects that I felt like, I'm sure many of you who are writers know this feeling where I've already written about that, I can't write it again, or I've done that before, and so it just became this list of things in my head. And then, of course, what happened was it turned into a poem. The end of poetry. Enough of osseous and chickadee and sunflower and snowshoes, maple and seeds, samara and shoot. Enough chiaroscuro, enough of thus and prophecy, and the stoic farmer and faith in our Father and 'tis of thee. Enough of bosom and bud, skin and God not forgetting, and star bodies and frozen birds. Enough of the will to go on or not go on, or how a certain light does a certain thing. Enough of the kneeling and the rising and the looking inward and the looking up. Enough of the gun, the drama, and the acquaintance's suicide, the long-lost letter on the dresser. Enough of the longing and the ego and the obliteration of ego. Enough of the mother and the child, and the father and the child. And enough of the pointing to the world, weary and desperate. Enough of the brutal and the border. Enough of can you see me? Can you hear me? Enough I am human. Enough I am alone and I am desperate. Enough of the animal saving me. Enough of the high water. Enough sorrow. Enough of the air and its ease. I am asking you to touch me. Thank you. Thank you.
Please come forward and direct the question.
Please queue in the center aisle. A few minutes before 6, we'll key to that last question or two if you have a question.
I know, it's pressure, because it's like a microphone and it's right there. Oh, yes. A brave one.
What is your favorite poem?
My favorite poem of all time? That's a great question. It changes because sometimes I need a certain poem, and that poem becomes my favorite, and then sometimes I need another poem. But I think Elizabeth Bishop's One Art might be my favorite poem. Thank you for that.
Is this working? Oh, okay. This is so satisfying. Hi. First of all, this reading is the highlight of my week. So
I'm so glad. Thank you.
Thank you. It was amazing, especially the last poem. I think there's this Instagram account called Poetry is Not Luxury, and I'm pretty sure I feel like I saw that on there, and now I want to read more. But anyway, so to get to the point. I'm wondering what you think about cliches and what the role of cliches has been in your work, and if there's ever a point where you're just have I written everything I will ever write for the end of time? How do you pick yourself up from this space that artistic paralysis and working with cliches, or maybe working with being more direct in your poetry, and maybe swapping figurative language for just this is how I'm feeling viscerally right now, and I just need to get it out on a page?
Yeah, that's a great question. I really appreciate that. I'll say that there's two things that I'll say is that one, I feel like it's all about interrogation. So it feels to me like when there's a moment where I'm just saying the direct thing or it feels direct, I ask myself like, is that direct? Is that the thing? Or is there more going on? And sometimes the figurative language comes into that, or the imagistic language, or maybe it just needs sounds, or something that will actually explain it further or elucidate it more so that it's not just the feeling anymore or the straightforward thing, but that it builds into something that's just my own. And that is something, so it's like always asking the thing, is this true? Is this true? And then the other part I would say is that, especially with cliches, is that I love cliches. I think they're wonderful, and they exist for a reason. And then what's really fun about them is to tug them and pull them apart, to start going like, okay, so why do we say, I have a poem that's about like that idea of like it's always in the last place you look, and how silly that is. Like, oh, well, of course it is because you found it, but like. But I like the poem, sometimes just taking a cliche that someone says and then pulling it apart and looking at it. In my book, Bright Dead Things, I have a poem called Downhearted. And it's about this idea of like, picturing the heart actually down and like that it's sunk to the bottom of your torso, that it's downhearted, and that it's, on a couch with pulling up the blankets over its head. So I think sometimes it's just about interrogating the cliche and then breaking it apart.
Oh, thank you so much.
Yeah, of course.
I had a class and I showed up very late, so I apologize if I'm out of breath and if this was covered at the start. But as someone who's not a poet and sort of admires poets, could you describe a little bit what the editing process specifically for a poet of your caliber looks like? Because I think in the few interactions I've had with poets my age who are very talented, it feels very different than prose editing. And also, my imagination tells me that at least when I'm editing prose, I kind of know what I'm writing about from the beginning. But poetry, I feel like there are times when a new day brings sort of a new perspective, a new image.
Right.
What does that look like?
Yeah, that's great.
And
I think
maybe how do you know when a poem is done,
Right.
which also feels more tricky than perhaps prose.
Yeah, these are both great questions. Revision to me is actually, I think, really fun, but it is primarily where the writing happens in poetry, because we're working with such tiny units. It's so small that everything is compressed and everything is, sort of vibrating with the intensity of that white space around it, that silence around it, so that it has to become, sometimes it feels like you have like a tweezer and you're like just like moving pieces of rice around the page, but they're very important pieces of rice, But I think for me, a lot of it's about the sound quality. And so I compose out loud and I edit out loud so that I'm reading the poem over and over again. I'm listening for places where I've either cut the line too short and the breath doesn't catch up with it, or I stumble on it each time, or I'm looking for a place where I'm like, oh, this is actually, I love sound work, so it's easy for me to kind of get into the, consonants and assonants and, all the fun alliteration things, and then be like, okay, calm down, Ada, you don't need to, do acrobatics right now, just move the machine forward. So a lot of that is sound work. And then the other part is looking to figure out if when you asked about, coming to it like a different day and being like, well, what was the intention? Or, oftentimes I'm asking, okay, what is the intention of this original poem? Like this original draft? And how can I stay true to what the poem wants to do without it becoming just sort of where I want it to go? Or maybe I started with this idea that I wanted to write a poem about this, but then the poem wanted to do something entirely different. And usually what happens is when I revise and I fail, it's because I'm like, no, I wanted to write a poem about this. But I'm not looking at what the poem is actually doing. And the poem is often wiser than we are. And it feels like the poem really isn't happening until it has taught us something, which is the opposite of prose, where you start with this idea, and you're like, okay, I kind of know where I'm going, even though of course you learn as you go, and that's why we write. But there is this level in which, with the poem, it really does sometimes just come at you and go, oh, I didn't know that this was what it was supposed to teach me. And so I think that moment has to happen. And that's also similar to like how I know it's done, is that there's something that feels maybe not like a conclusion, but a wholeness, a completeness, something that feels like whatever it began as, it has fulfilled. Yeah.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Hi, thank you for being here. I have a related question. I read somewhere, and I hope this is true and I'm not making it up, that you started to write fiction and realized somehow that you were a poet and not a fiction writer. And I'd love to hear more about that moment and what that felt like and what exactly tipped you into that conclusion.
Okay, so not entirely off base, but I'll say this, is that I was always a poet. I had 3 books out, and then I decided I wanted to try my hand at fiction. And so I, quit my job and I was like, I'm going to be a full-time writer, which I don't know why I thought I could do that, but I guess it turned out okay, actually. But I moved out of New York and moved back to California, and I did write a novel. Many drafts of a failed novel, or a project that I learned a lot from. And as I was writing that novel, what happened was I was spending so much time in the life of other characters, which I wanted to do, because after 3 books of poetry, I was like, okay, that's like enough of myself, right? And then what happened was, then during the evenings, I would still kind of feel like writing something, but I would want to write these observations. I would want to write a little bit about myself. And that's really how the first book, or it's the 4th book, Bright Dead Things, came into being, which was, it was almost like a byproduct of like this novel I was working on, because I was storing up all these poems inside of me, and they would just come out like fully formed all the time. So you're not, I had always started as a poet, but that book does really kind of take some of its life form from the novel.
Thank you.
Yeah, of course.
Hi there. Thank you so much for being here and doing this. This was really lovely.
Yeah, thank you.
I was wondering, in your appointment as poet laureate and all of the books you've had, I'd imagine those are very codifying experiences in sort of your identity as a poet and as a writer. And so I was wondering, what sort of inspired you to keep creating and to keep writing in moments when you've maybe had more doubt about your place as a writer or as a creative person?
Yeah. I think that there's a lot of times where it's very easy to get down on oneself, no matter what you do, and it happens to me still. And there's moments where I think, oh, well, now that this appointment, has happened, I'll never write again. It's very easy for me to turn anything into, I'll just never write again. And sometimes, like, if I write a poem I'm really excited about, and people are like, this is great, and as soon as I get very elated, I pour myself a cocktail, and 2 seconds later, I'm like, well, I guess that's the last poem I've ever written. Like, I don't know what it is. So I think we all do it. We have this kind of self-talk that just is like, and I think as I have aged, I do think I've trusted it. Like, now it's like, okay, I'm 6 books in, they will come, and they work in seasons, and I work in seasons. So that now I trust the silence, so that if it isn't coming, I just think it's going to come. And it's going to come, for me, I love writing in the spring. It's like, so right now, all the trees are they're sleeping. They're starting to figure out what they're going to do. That's kind of where I'm at. And then things will come. So it's a lot about trusting that. I think the other thing I think about is that when people say, how could you write through a time like this, or it's like really hard right now, or this, I think about like, Phyllis Wheatley writing as an enslaved woman, I think about Sor Juana Inés de la Cruz writing, in Mexico all those years ago, and like holding her manuscript in my hands thinking, this is what she created at this time. So I'm always like trying to look at like the legacy of others and how that can inspire us, especially when I feel myself kind of getting down on, either myself or art in general. And, and I always pull myself up by thinking about how many people have done so much in such harrowing times.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Hi, thank you so much for being here today.
Thank you.
I had a question about your background in theater. Because theater is so much about, I guess, becoming a different character and becoming a different person, whereas poetry is about honesty. And in theater, you want to sound natural and up on stage, but in poetry, sometimes we like to play with language and do different things. So what was that transition like from you, and what do you think theater influences how you write poetry or vice versa?
That's a great question. I have never once regretted my undergraduate degree in theater. It was a great experience for me. I searched on campus. I went to the University of Washington in Seattle, and I remember, I had come from a town that was 30,000 people, and I went to a campus that was 40,000 people, and I was like, this is, I don't, where are my people? I didn't know what to do, and I remember sort of walking into the theater department, and everyone was like just sort of running around and like barefoot and laughing, and someone was like singing opera in the corner, and I was like, oh, I think I belong here. And it just felt like this. We were, everyone was everyone was interested in making things, and I think that was actually probably more healthy for me at the time than it was in the creative writing program, because I didn't have that background. It was a little more, I think it would have been too intimidating, and it might have even put me off. But so for me, I think one of the big things was that theater teaches you about breath. It teaches you about communication, and it teaches you about what it is to sort of stand in your being, and be present. And, if the best stage actors can do that and really embody someone else. And I think the other part of it was doing monologues really taught me a lot about what it was to write something that could turn and twist and move in such a short space. And then the last thing I'll say is that when I did take poetry in my junior and senior years, because I had exhausted the electives I could take inside the theater program, they were like, you need to move on. I went and I took these classes, and I was like, oh, I love this. And I had also realized that for the most part, I was speaking the words of others, right? That's what theater is. And I was also, at that time, really primarily working with the words of older white men. And so it felt like I had this opportunity to then write myself into the world. And that felt like it really felt like freedom. And I think once I found that kind of freeing space, I thought, okay, poetry's it. Yeah.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Hi, I'm wondering what your relationship is like to the speaker of your poems, and if 6 books in that's changed for you.
Yeah, that's a great question. I think in order to sort of protect each other as we talk about work, we always use the speaker in the poem is doing this, the speaker in the poem is this. And, when I sit down to the page, I'm the speaker, and so I feel like it's okay to conflate the two. I think sometimes it's nice to separate that when we talk about someone else's work, or even if we need to for ourselves, like the speaker is doing this. For the most part, I'm very comfortable with it just being me, and feeling in some ways that actually the more human I can get on the page, the more interesting the poem might be for myself as I'm making it. So I'm trying to actually look for a little even more intimacy beyond the word speaker. But that doesn't mean sometimes I still want to keep it as self-protection.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Hi. Thank you so much for the beautiful reading.
Thank you.
I just wanted to ask, as someone who I find needs poetry to properly enjoy life and love life. Have you ever had, and someone who finds it difficult when I can't write what I need to write or I am afraid to, have you ever had moments in which you feel like you need to write something but you can't, or you are afraid to write something? And how did you get through that, and how did that feel?
Yeah, that's a great question. Yeah, there have definitely been times where I felt like I haven't wanted to write something, or felt like I shouldn't write something. Who am I to write that? Or how might this do harm to those I love? That's probably one of the biggest things, is like, could this harm someone close to me? Is it my story to tell, or is it a joint story? Right? Is it a family story that's not just mine? There's a lot of those questions of ethics. And I'll be honest that I don't think we talk about it enough, because I think that what happens is sometimes we, as writers, are like, I'm the writer. I should be able to have all the freedom I want to write about whatever I want, which is a beautiful thing if you're not a human being that lives with other human beings. Or if you've never had a human relationship, then that's fine. But I think that, if we want our writing to have impact, then we also have to be aware that writing can have consequences. And I think that we actually should learn that, because you can write the hard thing, but unless you're ready to have that conversation, then don't share it. You might need to write it for yourself, and you might need to put it in a drawer. And I know lots of incredible poets who have written books upon books that are on shelves and will probably be published when someone passes away. And I think that that's okay. And I think that unless you're ready to sort of do some deeper excavation, or you're ready to approach whatever subject it is that might be terrifying you, then you may not be ready to share it with the world. And that is okay. Forcing it never works. It never works. So I think it's always good. Again, the goal is longevity, right? We want you to write, and we want you to keep writing. We don't want you to write and be like, oh, well, that was traumatic. Let's not do that again. Yeah. So I think it's always a way of protecting yourself, encouraging yourself, but making sure that you continue.
Thank you so much.
Yeah.
I'm probably like the 100th person to say thank you, but thank you
Oh,
for
well,
coming.
you're welcome. Thank you.
You were talking about earlier at the beginning how you push back against the myth of making art alone, and I wanted to ask if there was a moment, or if there was a process that made you realize that it was a myth, because I feel like it's very easy to succumb to it,
Yeah.
and it's much harder to internalize that feeling. Also, what's your pug's name?
Yeah, okay. Well, first of all, my pug is named Lily Bean Kudzu Marquardt Limón.
Okay, there you go.
And she is amazing. And she used to travel with me, but she's 12 now, and I feel like all she does is snore and sleep, and it would just be actually distracting because her snore is so loud. But yeah, she's fantastic. Okay, the other question, I just got distracted by my pug. Remind me what you just said before that.
Right.
See, I got distracted. I was
No,
like,
you're
my pug.
It's okay. Happens to me too. Just if there was a moment or a specific process.
Yes. You know what it was? It was that, you read literary biographies, or you look at these, poets that have hung out together, or novelists or artists, and you realize all these people were hanging out together. Or someone's like, you meet with someone and they're like, oh yeah, no, that was my teacher. I was like, I always loved Muriel Rukeyser, and I remember I studied with Sharon Olds, and Sharon Olds was like, yeah, Muriel Rukeyser was my teacher, and I was like, oh right, this is what this is. There are so many cycles and so many communities, and we think of so and so being on a pedestal or this and that, and I don't think it's true. And then the other thing is that it's yes, do we have to actually do the work alone? Yeah, for the most part you do. That's actually one of the things I like about it, because it takes a lot to do theater. It takes a lot of people to make theater. I get to do my art alone in my house in my slippers. So I think there is that part, but I think it's really I think it was that moment was in graduate school, is just watching everyone kind of come together and be in community. I didn't have that in the creative writing as an undergrad. I had that in theater, but I didn't know it in creative writing. But yeah, it came as a graduate school.
Great. Thank you so much.
Yeah.
Hi.
Hi.
Thank you so much again. This was great.
Thank you.
So I wanted to ask, I'm going to generalize a lot, so I apologize. But I notice in your poetry that on one hand you write a lot about the body, and on the other hand a lot about nature. And I was wondering how you conceptualize the relationship between the two. You know, is it a boundary? Is it a continuity? Is it a mirror? Like, is it all of those things or none of those things?
Yeah. I love that question. I think for me, it kind of depends on the day. You know, sometimes I'm like, oh, this feels like I am in tandem and connected to everything. And sometimes I feel like, oh, I am a machine that is walking around doing things with a head full of thoughts that is very separate, right? And I'm always trying to bring them together. And then there are moments where I feel like, oh, I am just as much animal as that squirrel. And why am I wearing clothes? Because it's weird that we're animals that wear clothes. So all of those things.
Thank you.
Hi, thank you so much for coming. Your reading was very moving. I was reading The Hurting Kind like a few days ago at the basement of one of our libraries, and I remember sitting there for 10 minutes. But I kind of wanted to ask about your writing, and partly because I think a lot of what you write about resonates with me in themes of grief and loss. And sometimes as a poet, I personally have had issues like writing about grief or loss that isn't my own. So the only time I have been able to write or express myself or release my pain has been through poetry, but it has been hard for me to reconstruct someone else's pain and then write about it. And so I was wondering, like, is that something you've done? Is that something you find an avenue of poetry from? And yeah, just wanted your thoughts.
Yeah. I think for me, for the most part, when I'm dealing with a grief or a loss poem, it feels like it's either very personal or it's very collective. And I have to have some part of that belongs to me. Some part of it that feels like, oh, this is also mine. And whether that's national grief, you know, whether that's communal grief. And so I have to find my thread and connection to it. If it's someone else's, I may not approach it. That's me as an artist. And that's also because I'm very wary of appropriating someone else's pain in order to perpetuate art. Not everyone feels that way, but I do. So I feel like there's a way in which that it has to feel like some thread of it belongs to me enough so that I can have an intimate experience in the making of it, and that I feel urgently connected to it. Otherwise, it might feel a little too much like a project or a manipulation.
Right.
Yeah.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you for coming. And kind of similar to the last question of having experiences of grief and pain and loss, but then wanting to let those experiences go, but at the same time wanting to like create, and how there's this like situation where you want to let go, but then you also want to create something lasting. And how do you deal with that problem?
Yeah, I think that for me, to me that's you have to get curious. So I find myself in those situations asking myself, what is it that wants to hold on to this? Why this moment? Why did this person come back to me right now? Why does this feel almost like, you know, something worth living for, this pain? I have to get very curious about those things. And it's asking yourself, okay, is there a lesson here? Is there something that this is supposed to teach me? What's the gift I got from this? You know? It's starting to ask those questions about those losses. And in doing so, unraveling why it is that they're so instrumental to who we are.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Hi. Oh my God. So you mentioned your friend of yours named Natalie Diaz, and am I correct in assuming that's the author of Postcolonial Love Poems?
Yes.
Love that book. Love yours as well.
Yeah. She has, so Postcolonial has the other set of the poems that are written to each other.
Oh,
Yeah.
that's fantastic.
Yeah.
Okay, I'll go back and look for it. But there's this line from Postcolonial Love Poem that I think about always, and I'm definitely not going to be quoting it word for word, but it goes something like, "It is real work not to perform a fable. Just ask the turtle, ask the hare." And I kind of wanted to ask you, whose poems I've read and seem so free and liberating and have this sense of reverence for what is small, both small and beautiful. And I kind of wanted to ask how you negotiate those terms as someone who maybe does exist within the marginalized. And just as a writer myself, I would love to emulate some of those freedoms and hear your process.
Yeah, I think that's really beautiful, and it's a great question to end on, because I think it's really essential to how we all work. I think that, as I mentioned earlier about like how I like to push against like the unhelpful myths, right? The things that are like, this is not helpful to me, this is not useful to me. I think in the same way that as soon as someone wants to tell me that I need to write about some specific thing, I will immediately be like, no, I do not need to do that. And there's this like wickedness in me that immediately wants to deny any part of like when someone is like, oh, you know, you're Mexican, so where's your abuela poem, or your, you know, all of these things. And immediately I'm like, no, I'm going to write about this tree. And that's what I'm going to write about, you know? And then sometimes, like, 6 years later, I'll be like, okay, here's my grandpa poem, or here's my grandma poem. But, there's these ways in which that I think I'm very suspicious of what is asked of us, especially as writers of color, and how we get put into categories that don't have anything to do with beauty, joy, hope, and freedom. And I'm very suspicious of the people who want to publish trauma, bias, that want to publish, only, write to us when you have the border story, write to us when this and this and this and this. It's like, well, what if I don't have any even signifiers in there? Would you be interested if it was good work? Right? So I'm always pushing against it. And I think it doesn't mean I don't interrogate it in my own work. It doesn't mean it's not there. But to me, it feels... I grew up at a time as a writer where every poem that was published by a black man in a certain journal always had to have a bullet in it in order to get published, right? And if you were Latinx, you better have arroz con pollo. Like it was like this and it was like, oh my God, this is in these big journals that I shouldn't name, but and it and I saw that, and I remember very early on being like, I want everyone else's freedom. And guess what? They can't give it to me. I can only take it for myself.
Thank you. That was wonderful.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you.